Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
We have a fun conversation for tonight. There was a lot of drama on Twitter/X pre-holidays where one of the Microsoft MVPs had posted a tweet talking about how Microsoft is now recommending that all new devices be deployed as cloud native Entra Join, and deploying any device as Entra Hybrid Join is not recommended, including through Autopilot. And this was a big deal because it never really had been said out loud. Autopilot was always not really recommended for hybrid devices, and that is no secret. The person who had headed up Autopilot engineering, Michael Neilhouse, back in the day, had basically said that we came up with Autopilot for hybrid join because organizations had asked for it, but it was really not something that Microsoft wanted to do. We'd always use that technology for the cloud native devices first. But now the documentation, official Microsoft documentation, now says we don't even recommend deploying new devices as hybrid join, which is a big deal. We're now just recommending cloud native devices. And there was a lot of drama on Twitter because people were upset about this. They wanted to cling to that hybrid join and continue down that path. So tonight, we wanted to talk about what that really means, device identity versus device management, where, just changing where that device lives doesn't necessarily mean that you have to change how you manage that device. And then some of the things that may be some barriers or reasons why organizations are afraid to move to pure cloud native Entra Join that Adam and I have heard through customers or through our own experiences. So one of the biggest things that we really want to fundamentally understand is the difference between device identity and device management and how those work together. And device identity is where that device lives. Either Entra being cloud native, formerly known as Azure AD, or hybrid or domain joined device. And they're the same. If it is a domain joined device, that is the same as a hybrid joined device. There's just a tiny registration that happens on the back end that Azure/Entra can recognize, and then you can do things to it differently. But fundamentally, if it is hybrid or domain join, the identity that you sign into on that device is going to be an on-prem identity. And if it's cloud native, you're going to sign in with a cloud native identity, user identity in this case. Now, there is no difference generally between the user identity and passwords that's signing in whichever device, because we have a fancy little AD sync where we sync the two identities together, but they are two separate identities. So that is the fundamentals of how it works, but that doesn't affect how you can manage it for the most part. There are ways that domain join can be managed, there are ways that cloud join can be managed, and there are ways that can manage both of them. And most likely you already have some of those tools in order to do that, like SCCM, Intune, co-management, where you can have the device live in either place and be managed by either tool.
I think that's a good summary. Always great to start there, because whenever we start talking about device identity, sometimes concerns about device management come in. And in fact, in the Twitter thread, people started conflating the two things. And a member of one of the Microsoft PGs made a what appears to be a strategic shift in device management strategy coming from Microsoft, whereas we can talk about that maybe in a little bit, because I don't want to conflate it in the context of this conversation as well. But Andy, I think that's a good summary. I'd say for the most part, for the way most customers operate today, those decisions kind of influence each other, but like you said, they don't really directly like change how you do either one. Like, and that's an important distinction to make. So sometimes there's the perception that if I move from hybrid join to Entra joins to full cloud native device identity, then I can no longer use configuration manager. And that is just not true. You can absolutely continue to use configuration manager, provided it's configured in a co-management state with Intune as well. So that's an example of some of the fear or uncertainties or doubt that customers have oftentimes about the move from hybrid join to Entra join as one example. But we do want to clarify, we're really focused on the device identity and the impact and changes that makes, not necessarily device management, although by virtue of the conversation, we'll end up talking about both.
And since you mentioned it, let's just start there.
Perfect.
Because I think a lot of organizations fear that if you move from a hybrid identity to a cloud native identity for your devices, then you won't be able to manage it with the current tools. And a lot of orgs say Intune doesn't have parity with the current tools that I'm using. If you're using co-management, you can technically manage a cloud native device purely with SCCM. It's generally not done that way, but you can do it. So in order for your cloud native devices to be managed by SCCM, they have to have line of sight to get those policies from SCCM. And that's usually done by two different ways. One, very simply, could just be a VPN. You have to have line of sight to a distribution point using network connectivity, and that could just be a VPN. The other way is the cloud management gateway, which has been around for a long time, which is essentially a hosted distribution point through Microsoft, a service that you can get to your SCCM instance from anywhere using HTTPS. And so those two ways, as long as you have the agent deployed, which you can easily do through Intune, deploy your SCCM agent to your cloud native Entra Join devices, have line of sight to a distribution point, either through VPN or the cloud management gateway, then you can technically solely manage it if those sliders on your co-management SCCM instance is all the way onto SCCM and not with Intune. You can manage those cloud native devices using SCCM. Most of the time, you're going to start sliding those sliders towards Intune to bring on some policies like configuration, or Windows update is usually kind of the first thing that goes. And other things, maybe start moving compliance over to Intune. But that is the state of co-management, and it can be fully cloud native Entra Join devices because it's co-management. So it's partly SCCM, partly Intune. And that device identity has no bearing on how that device is managed. Now, you can't use GPOs to manage a cloud native device. That's one thing that you can't do. However, I think that is another objection that we've heard where, hey, we have all these GPOs and Intune doesn't have it. Yes, not every single GPO that has ever been around is going to have the same parity policy within Intune, because there are GPOs for Internet Explorer 9, Internet Explorer 8, that you probably, if you haven't looked through your GPO, you may not realize what all is a part of those particular policies that's built in, that you can just export your GPOs into an XML file, upload it into the GPO analyzer within Intune, and then it'll spit out an exact policy that it would be parity with, and it'll tell you whether or not there is a policy for it or not. And the beauty of it is, even if there, for some reason, isn't a setting for that particular GPO, you can still set it, because by default, GPOs are just registry entries, and you can still use an ADMX profile and create a custom policy to flip that switch for that particular registry, whatever it is that you need to do. So it can be done. So that's the bottom line, is if you have a GPO, if it's available as a feature within Windows 10 and 11, for some reason it's not available in the template for Intune, you can still create a custom ADMX profile and upload it and change it. So I guess that would be my comment on the barriers for GPOs, right?
It is the number one objection. The first one customers bring up whenever we talk about Entra Join, our GPO. And I think that was certainly warranted feedback once upon a time. I think that story has evolved for several reasons. Number one, with the group policy analyzer built into Intune, that can help solve 90% of it. Yeah, but it doesn't have the 18 of them. There's 18 that are missing, so therefore I can't move. Like, first off, what are those 18? Are they Internet Explorer 7 GPOs that are deprecated because IE7 is deprecated? Like, what are they? Let's do a little deeper dive in them. And then second, I think our approach to device management needs to change somewhat. And I think this has been a shift that has happened over time. It's not 2005 anymore. Like, it's not a bunch of Dell workstations sitting on everyone's desk hardwired into Ethernet that never leave your office, right? I mean, it's a different world. And that kind of management strategy needs to shift. And I will say, one of the things that surprised me, and again, this is not saying Microsoft is the only correct way to do this, and as long as I brought it up, Andy and I do both work for Microsoft in our security business in the field. One of the things that surprised me when I first got my Microsoft company issued PC was how light the management is on it. Like, we don't have MSIT enforce a ton of settings on us. Anything related to absolutely critical security or just like really common sense stuff, sure. But we're allowed an incredible amount of latitude in how we want to configure and manage and use our devices. And it's astonishing that you can be an organization that is one of the most heavily attacked organizations in the world and still do somewhat light touch management. And so this leads me to believe it is possible for organizations of all shapes and sizes, big, small, to maybe do a little lighter touch in management. And so maybe some of those GPOs you just don't need, period, because that's not an appropriate management strategy for today. Your users can choose their own setting for this or choose their own setting for that. It's not going to be the end of the universe. So this is one of those things that's really a broader conversation. Andy, when we talk to customers about it in the past, we've always articulated this is that inflection point where it's time to rethink how you do this and not just carry 24 years of legacy management forward. Some of those could date all the way back to the Windows 2000 days. And I think if there was ever a time to say, gosh, let's take another look at these, let's see if we still need them, now is that time. And so I'm sensitive to the fact that it's not just a drop-in replacement and just snap your fingers and it's done. There is work involved, but so many things have made a transition over time that have afforded that opportunity to reevaluate them. And device management, to be fair, has mostly avoided that conversation. Device management may be one of the IT functions that has evolved the least over the past 10 to 15 years. And that technical debt is coming due. And part of paying the interest on that technical debt are doing things like doing a full top to bottom GPO review. And I know that's not pleasant for anyone to do or pleasant for anyone to hear, and we try to simplify it as much as possible, but this work needs to be done. The worst thing to do would be to move to this new device identity paradigm and just carry all your legacy technical debt with you. and technical management strategy with you from an era that no longer exists. So good conversation there for sure. I think most customers can get where they need to be through the combination of, like you talked about, Andy, group policy analyzer, use co-management with configuration manager if you still need some of the controls there. And at the end of the day, use an ADMX template, or worst case scenario, push a PowerShell script. You can solve for this one of those ways. So ultimately, let's move forward and let's find some other objections to work through.
Yeah, I'm going to go a little out of order from our notes because I think it fits here. You talk about how don't carry over that technical debt.
Mm-hmm.
One of the best ways to start with this is to just start it. Just join a device to Entra and see what you can and cannot do. By default, anyone can join a device unless you turn it off or scope it to a specific group. Just like domain joining a machine. By default, anyone can join a machine to your domain if they're a legitimate user, unless you turn that off. Once you do that, the only thing that changes is the identity that you're signing into that machine with. So if it's Entra Join, you're going to sign in with an Entra ID. And then you see what you can and cannot do. You'll need applications. Okay, then let's create an application package within Intune and let's deploy that app and go from there. Oh, I need my VPN. Okay, let's deploy that in a package, get that installed. I need my EDR, my AV, whatever it is, right? So you create a package, deploy it, and then you start doing things. Oh, I want my start menu to be like this, or I want my background to be this, or I need my Wi-Fi profile. So you start creating policies, you start pushing them out, and then you slowly build that image, not necessarily image, but you layer all your policies onto your image, and then you go from there. So as you look at your GPOs, you may think, oh, I need this one for my devices, or I need this one for a specific resource, and you build those into it. And I'm guessing as you're going through this exercise and seeing what you can and cannot do through your daily process, you're going to discover that there are many GPOs that you don't need. And so the easiest way to do this is to just start. So I think people are afraid because it seems like it's a massive undertaking, when in reality, you can get productive work very, very quickly by just scoping a few policies and pushing out the must-need things, right? Like you need your security, so let's just push that out, right?
It's iterative. That's how you do it. You iterate on it. You can't solve for it all at once, and you never will be successful anyway. You iterate. You get started, you see where you are, you add on a little more and a little more. And I would agree, Andy, that sometimes it must be like the load of laundry problem, where if you've ever had like the laundry build up at your house, and the bigger the problem gets, the less you're motivated to bite it off, versus if it's just, hey, just do a load of laundry, not even a full load. It's no big deal. Pull it out, fold some clothes, you're done in 5 minutes, whatever. But when it becomes like, man, I need to do 8 loads of laundry, now you'd never want to start. And to your point, Andy, if you do this iteratively, you'll realize it's not that bad. It's just one bite at a time. And the other thing you'll realize with that is you will solve for some of these concerns on your own. Because when customers say things like, well, I can't access on-prem resources, I'm like, yes, you can. Like, what do you mean? I'm like, it just works. Absolutely, you can. You have an identity that has the same, effectively, UPN as your on-premises identity, unless you're doing something weird. And so when I go knock on the door of a file server and say, hey, I'm this username and I'm this password, those match your on-prem identity. It says, all right, come on in. What files do you need? Or I want to print to this printer. Same sort of thing. A lot of that just works out of the box with no changes required. And I can't tell you how many people, how many IT professionals, smart people, have tried to tell me that you can access on-premises resources with Entra Join devices. And this is where, like, Andy, I know you and I, like, we're not trying to come off like as know-it-alls here, or like this is easy, but this is how we've been running our devices for literally 6 years now. And like everything just works. And I know MSIT does a really good job and is bleeding edge in a lot of ways, but it's not just that. Like, they had the guts to start, and of course they did, because they're MSIT. It's a different ballgame. I get that, but like, these are all solvable challenges. It's not like this is a flying car. It's just a computer, and it's not that difficult to get to a place where you can be, like you said, productive, start to use some of your tools and understand the current state. It's the best way to learn, and then the best way to actually build it out as well. So, and we've articulated this on this show many times. Just start.
Yeah, by default, all apps that are configured for some Windows integrated authentication will seamlessly get single signed on into when a user tries to access them from an Entra Join device. You need a few things in order to access a resource. Number one, you need network connectivity. So obviously you need to either be on-prem with a network that has access to that resource, or you need a VPN or some sort of network connectivity. Two, you need to be able to resolve DNS. So again, if you're on-prem, my guess is it's going to redirect to your domain controllers for DNS by default, or if you're on VPN, you'll need to have some sort of connectivity to redirect for DNS to resolve it for that particular resource, unless you're, for some reason, accessing that resource by IP address. And then finally, you need to have a user with authorization to that particular resource. So, kind of the basics, right? Network connectivity, DNS resolution, and an authorized user for that particular resource. The user, by username, like Adam said, is generally the same, unless you're doing something funky with your domains or syncing up different weird users. Most companies are using the same username through AD Sync, that is the same username and password from on-prem to Entra. So if all that is true, then when you have those three things and you try to sign into a resource, it will just do the thing, because that's what Windows is designed to do. If for some reason one of those things is off, like for example, the username, like if Windows doesn't know the user that's trying to authenticate, it will just pop up a username and password. That's what it does on Macs, right? Because on Macs, you're signing into the operating system using a local administrator, a local user that's local to the Mac OS. And so when you try to access a resource, even though you might have DNS resolution and you have network connectivity, that user isn't past that resource. So what does it do? It pops up a username and password. And then you put in your username and password, and it signs you in. Now, that's the same behavior if you were to use passwordless, like Windows Hello for Business or FIDO2. Because again, when you're using passwordless, it doesn't have the username and password. So this is for Windows, not for Mac. Mac is always going to be like that. But for Windows, if you're using a passwordless authentication method, you're not passing that username and password to the operating system through to that resource that you're trying to access. Again, even though you might have network connectivity and DNS resolution, it doesn't know the username. So what does it do? Pops up a username and password field. You type it in. That can be configured to single sign-on in with a few configuration things, and we'll post the documentation to do it, but you need to enable passwordless security key sign-on for on-prem resources with Entra ID. And it's a pretty easy configuration. Once it's done, that passwordless method, as soon as you sign in and then you try to access, say, a file share that's on-prem, whack, andyjaw.fileshare.local, whatever it is, and it will just pass the username through and you're signed in. So it is a urban legend or urban myth or whatever you want to call it that Entra Join devices can't access on-prem resources. They absolutely can. All you need are those three things, and pretty easy to grant. And then you have access. And of course, there are other ways to do it. Like if you have some weird on-prem app, you just need VPN, or you can configure it with like app proxy if it's like a web app or something like that, and you have access to your on-prem resources. But either way, it's very easy to configure as long as you have those three things: network connectivity, DNS resolution, and an authorized user for that resource.
And app proxy, Andy, you called out, one of the things I've mentioned to customers and on this show is while app proxy is great for doing that remote access to an application outside the corporate network, you can access it from anywhere if you have an internet connection. But what it also does extremely well is it translates web-based single sign-on technologies to legacy single sign-on technologies. In fact, I think it almost buries the lead when you don't talk about that, because that's what the magic secret sauce of that is I have this ancient app that uses like Kerberos of some kind, and I can put app proxy in front of it. And if I have a Mac OS device and it's already signed in with Entra ID, I've been accessing other online resources like my Outlook online account or Teams, and I go try to hit that app, even if it's some ancient apps that uses Windows integrated authorization, which Mac OS has no idea how to talk to, I'll still get single sign-on because it will do that translation automatically. Well, that's also super valuable for this scenario, for Entra Join devices. As long as you're going to go to cloud native device identity, why not try to limit your dependencies on-prem even further? Maybe make your VPN on demand instead of always on, because you don't need it all the time. A lot of your apps are enabled with app proxy. That could be a further down the road step. I don't want you to think like you have to solve all of that day one to get Entra Join functional, because our whole conversation has been to the opposite. But thinking long term about how can I make this even more mature? How can I make this even more, even less dependent on that corporate network? There's further ways you can do that as well. You can eliminate even more technical debt over time. And none of that I talked about requires you to refactor the app, rehost the app, do anything. You can keep running it wherever it's been running, and you don't have to change the code. Even if the person who wrote the code is gone from the company for 20 years, you're fine, because app proxy will just do that translation automatically. So there are ways to solve for this. And like Andy talked about, for the most part, it's going to work out of the box. For the other 90% of it, for passwordless scenarios, it's literally a pretty simple configuration, a couple of tweaks, and then you'll have that single sign-on even when you sign in passwordless with a FIDO2 key or with Windows Hello for Business. And for anything else, you can stand up app proxy or Entra Private Access, and you have basically solved your app access challenges and you're good to go. So again, it's solvable, and out of the box, it's going to work for most scenarios.
I'm going to touch on this final point, which I think is a bit of a pain point for more customers and organizations that I'd like to admit, because I've run into several through my time. But Wi-Fi has actually been a significant barrier for a lot of organizations to get to Entra Join. And that is because a lot of orgs use some sort of old method of authentication, getting certificates from Active Directory for your devices, where your devices have some sort of certificate that has been installed from the domain join, and then that authorizes them for the Wi-Fi, like through something like MSChap or MSChap v2, which are older methods of authentication. Most orgs should be moving to TLS, but if you're not, then you won't be able to really do a Wi-Fi profile that is deployed through Intune to get to your corporate network. And that has happened to many customers that I've actually talked to. And so this is where you do have to work with kind of both the network team and the device management team, which at a lot of organizations are two separate departments. And one team may be trying to move forward and get to that Entra Join, while the other team says, hey, this is our Wi-Fi. And you have to understand that, like, network guys in general, guys and gals, are, if it works, don't touch it. It's like they need the network to be up. They need it to be running, because if the network is down, then the company has problems. And so if it's working and everything else is working, then in general, they don't want to change a whole lot of stuff. That's, in my opinion, what I've run into for a lot of network guys and gals, just network folks in general. They don't want big change.
Right.
So in this case, if they're not looking to change from MS-CHAP v2 or certificates from the domain controller, you can compromise and just say, well, this is where we're trying to go with device management. You can use a pre-shared key and deploy that particular Wi-Fi profile via device management like Intune and still be able to access corporate networks. Arguably, pre-shared keys are not as secure, and some people may shudder at the fact that you're going to use a pre-shared key on a corporate network, but it's not a final destination. It's a bridge. It'll get you to that Entra Join, and WPA2, WPA3, you can use up to a 63 character limit for your pre-shared key. And if it's 63 characters, that's not really something that's brute forceable. So, in my opinion, that is good enough. Like, you have to have physical proximity in order to attack a Wi-Fi, and brute force a 63 character, pass pre-shared key. I think that's pretty safe, in my opinion. It's all about risk and what you're comfortable with, but in my opinion, that's good enough. And that will get you over the hump if your network team is unwilling to change how they're doing their Wi-Fi. And you can still have some devices. You don't have to change your old devices. It's not all at once, right? It's iterative over a period of time, and all your new devices can get this. And then once someone decides to change that Wi-Fi, then great. We can deploy a new Wi-Fi profile. Very easy. Just everything's already joined. We just deploy a new Wi-Fi profile with the cert, modern way of authenticating to Wi-Fi with TLS cert, and then you're good to go. So I think there are ways to solve for even some of these more nuanced methods and arguments of why we're not moving to it. So I think, just work with whatever department it is, compromise, and see if that is good enough.
Yeah, great call out there on the Wi-Fi. And I will say, from the customers I've run into who have been running some of those legacy methods, they almost always lead with, we know we need to change. We know we need to modernize it. And like you talked about, Andy, the network guys are saying that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, you start to get the point of it's kind of broke because it's now inhibiting our ability to get modern over here. And so it can be that impetus to get them to move forward versus in the past, it wasn't causing any problems. Well, now it kind of is. And I think if they get that push, many of them, in my experience, have been very amenable to moving forward. They just need a driver or a reason to do it other than change for change's sake. And this is not that. This is actually, from a device management perspective, like I called out before, has really avoided evolving to like a cloud native architecture as the rest of IT has been evolving to that strategy. Endpoint management has stayed very static. We're still very on-prem world for them, and they have the opportunity to step into that larger world, and we hope they start doing that. And Andy, one final note you had in here in the show notes, and I think you touched on it a little bit, but I just want to go back to this point. You have here, what about my gold image? And then you respond, use the default image and layer on your policies and apps, and then in parentheses, just like every other OS. And so I just want to really emphasize that. I know Windows has occupied a very special place in the world of enterprise IT, and I've been the beneficiary of that by virtue of my employment at Microsoft. Andy, you have as well. But the fact is, every other operating system in the world, you use the operating system that the vendor provides you, and then you layer on configuration and applications as needed. And the only other platform that once upon a time did allow you to do imaging was Mac OS. And if you haven't been paying attention to what's gone on in the Mac for the last half decade or so, the Mac has moved away from that as well. Apple started shipping coprocessors even on their Intel based Macs in the late 2010s. So I have a 2018 Mac Mini here. It has what Apple calls the T2 like security coprocessor in it. And one of the things the T2 does is it validates the cryptographic signature of the operating system before it's allowed to boot. Therefore, I can't just make an own custom image and blast it onto every Mac Mini or the single Mac Mini I have. It will refuse to boot. So instead, I use a cryptographically signed OS image from Apple, and then I can manage it with Intune, and then layer on all the controls and applications I need as appropriate. And mobile devices have been this way from square one on the Android side and on the iOS side. So what this is really moving is Windows moving to that same model where we already have a good image on there. Every OEM is shipping a good image on there. Let's just fire it up, sign in the user, and then start to download the policies and apps they need. And that dovetails into my last point. And then Andy, you can make any final points you want to wrap the show. We started off when we first started talking about the show, talking about this documentation in the context of Autopilot. And it's on the Autopilot documentation where it says, hey, we really don't recommend using hybrid join devices at all. And the note even clarifies and says, we're talking beyond just the context of Autopilot. And so that is true. That is also true for as you're starting to dip your toe into the water of Entra Join. Sometimes I talk to customers, they have the perception that we have to move to Autopilot to even try out Entra Join. We have to get rid of all our GPOs, and we have to have everything moved off of on-premises before we can even start. And the whole point of this show is to prove all of that is not true. Well, Autopilot is also not a prerequisite to do this. It is very easily possible to boot a device that is not registered in Autopilot in the Windows out-of-box experience, the UBI, and say, hey, this is a worker school PC, and I'd like to configure it. And by default, it will walk you through doing an Entra Join. That's, if you say this is a worker school device, that's the first thing it will do. So Autopilot is also not a requirement to do any of this. But once you have done all this homework, then Autopilot gets much more valuable.
Yeah, and I think my final point is a lot of IT organizations want a homogeneous environment. And that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. And even if you want a homogeneous environment, you still manage devices differently when they're part of different organizations, like kiosks or, manufacturing floor devices, shared devices. All of those have a way to be configured within Entra Join devices, but you don't necessarily need to get rid of your old devices or reconfigure everything. Like, I would start with your remote workers and your folks who are information workers, and then move to maybe some shared kiosks if that makes sense, but leave your, say, OT environments out of it, right? That definitely should be last if there's specialized networks, specialized devices. Just start with the low-hanging fruit, which is your information workers and maybe your frontline workers, and then your shared kiosks. Like, those would be the order that I would do things in. And if it still makes sense to have something that is on-prem then do it, right? Like, it doesn't necessarily say you have to get rid of on-prem completely. Just start doing new devices with Entra Join. So don't think of it that you have to get rid of everything in order to do it. Just like, Adam, you were saying, just to start, we would have to get rid of everything on-prem. You're not going to get rid of everything on-prem. Like, that's going to be around for a very, very long time. You're going to need it. But servers, another example, right? Like, servers can still be domain joined. They can still be hybrid if you really need it, but we recommend them to be, hosted in the cloud, but you can still host them on-prem if you want to, and they will still be managed through GPO. So there's going to be some use for your on-prem infrastructure, but when it comes to endpoints, workstations, this is what we're talking about here, right? Deploy those in an Entra state.
You made one more really good point that I just want to reemphasize is, in fact, it is not a supported deployment methodology to take existing deployed devices that are hybrid joined and flip them to Entra joined. That's not supported and is definitely not recommended. Even if you can figure out a hacky way to do it, don't. So with that said, your only option to even roll out Entra joined devices is through attrition, is as you do device refresh. So you not only do not need to worry about like trying to do it all at once, the fact is you cannot. It's not possible. So that's the other reason we keep saying, like, you just need to get started. You just need to get started, because if you just get started, you're still staring down a multi-year effort to get switched, because there's no good way to do this to all your devices that are already deployed. So this is a multi-year effort. No matter what you do, it is a burn down approach over time as devices come in for refresh.
Yeah, technically it is possible in the fact that you would unjoin your device from the domain, then rejoin it to Entra, and then sign in with a whole new identity, which would then create a whole new profile. So all of your icons on your desktop and all of that, it's going to disappear because a whole new profile, right? So it is feasible, but the point is that you're making, Adam, is you should just repave it and start from scratch, because that's exactly what you're doing. When you unjoin a machine from the domain, rejoin it to Entra, sign in with a brand new user identity, create a brand new profile on the device. I mean, everything's going to be fresh, and you might as well just start from scratch and do it right from the start.
Right, because all that junk is still there under that old user profile anyway, too.
Exactly. All right, well, that was quite a lot, and this is always a fun conversation when we get to talk about device identity and device management. So hopefully you guys learned a lot. If you have any questions, please let us know. Our contact information will be in the show notes, as well as documentation to what we talked about tonight. If you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about, please contact us. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.